Hello everybody, welcome to our weekly series of the Indian Express Explained section. In this particular video discussion, we shall be taking up the important articles which have appeared in the Indian Express Explained section for the third week of June 2021 and have not been covered in our DNS videos. The first article for this week's Explained section is the Federal Reserve Signals and the Indian Markets. This article shall be important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of Indian economy. Before discussing as to why this article becomes important for the prelims examination, let me first discuss the background. See, recently the US Fed Bank has announced its monetary policy. In its latest monetary policy, the US Fed Bank has decided to continue with the quantitative easing. But at the same time, the US Fed Bank has hinted that by end of 2023, the US Fed Bank may start increasing the policy rates. So, even though the US Fed Bank has decided to continue with the quantitative easing, it has merely hinted that it may increase the policy rates in future. Now, this particular hint given by US Fed Bank has in turn impacted the Indian economy in multiple ways. It has impacted us in terms of the foreign inflows. It has impacted us in terms of the value of rupee. It has also impacted us in terms of the yield rates on the government securities in India. Hence, from the perspective of the UPSC prelims examination, UPSC could probably ask you a question as to how the US Fed Bank's actions can have an impact on the Indian economy. Apart from that, see, in the recent times, the yield rates on the government securities has been increasing, and the Reserve Bank of India has been desperately trying to bring down these yield rates. The RBI has been taking a number of policy initiatives such as the Operation Twist, the GSAP program, so on, in order to reduce the yield rates on the government securities. So, instead of asking as to what these Operation Twist and GSAP are all about, UPSC could ask you as to what are the factors which are affecting the yield rates of the government securities. So, instead of a direct question, UPSC could ask you an indirect question on the factors affecting the yield rates. Similarly, we could also expect a question as to what are the factors or the reasons which are led to the increase in the yield rates on the government securities in the recent times and how they have an impact on the Indian economy. Hence, keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC prelims examination, we will be covering these topics. We will start with the basics, wherein we'll discuss the types of monetary policies followed in US, the relationship between the bond price and the bond yields, the various factors which are affecting the yield rates, particularly how does the government borrowings affect the yield rates, the relationship between the rate of interest in India and the yield rates, the relationship between the rate of interest in US and the yield rates, and so on. At the end of this particular discussion, you should be in a position to attempt these two prelims questions for the practice. So let's start with the basics first, that is the types of monetary policies in US. I hope all of you must be knowing that in case of India, we have basically two types of policies, that is the expansionary monetary policy and the other one is the contractionary monetary policy. The expansionary monetary policy is basically followed by the Reserve Bank of India in order to inject the rupee liquidity into the Indian economy, and this is basically done in order to promote economic growth when the Indian economy is under the recession. Similarly, the contractionary monetary policy is followed in order to suck out the excess liquidity from the Indian economy, and this is followed when there is a higher rate of inflation. So similar to these two, we have two types of policies in US, that is quantitative easing and the Fed tapering. Quantitative easing can be considered to be kind of expansionary monetary policy, whereas the Fed tapering can be considered to be a kind of contractionary monetary policy. So quantitative easing in case of US is basically done in order to inject the dollars into the US economy, bring down the policy rates and thus promote the economic growth. Whereas under the Fed tapering, the US Fed Bank finally decides to put an end to the quantitative easing. That is, it decides to put an end to the injection of dollars, and this leads to increase in the rate of interest. And by doing that, the US Fed Bank would be able to bring the rising inflation under control. So whenever the US Fed Bank switches from quantitative easing to Fed tapering or from Fed tapering to quantitative easing, this in turn has an impact on the Indian economy, about which we will be discussing later. Now coming to the relationship between the bond price and the bond yield. Now let's say I'm an investor and I bought a government security from the RBI directly. Let's say I bought this government security at a face value of rupees 100. The coupon rate is 10% and the maturity period is 5 years. This means that I'm entitled to get rupees 10 in the form of interest on an annual basis, and I have basically paid rupees 100 in order to purchase this particular government security. So for me here, the bond price, that is the price at which I am purchasing this government security, the bond price is equal to the face value, that is rupees 100. And my yield, that is my return on this government security, it would be equal to the coupon rate, that is 10%. So if you convert this 10% in of rupees 100, it will be rupees 10. So this is my bond price and bond yield. This is applicable to me when I'm buying this government security directly from the Reserve Bank of India. But when these government securities are traded in the secondary market, that is on the stock exchanges, the bond price and bond yield will be different. That means in the secondary market, the bond price will be different from the face value and the bond yield will be different from the interest rate or the coupon rate. Let's understand as to how this changes. Now let's say that I'm an investor A who has already bought this government security. So for me the bond price is rupees 100 and the bond yield is 10%. Now let's say there is an investor B. Now this investor B is willing to purchase this government security from me at rupees 110. Now, the face value of this government security is 100, but this investor is willing to purchase this bond at rupees 10 more, that is at 110. Now, why is that? This is because the demand for the government securities may have increased. So, because there is a higher demand, investor B is willing to purchase this government security at a higher price at rupees 110. Now let's consider another scenario when the demand for the government security has got reduced. So when the demand for the government security has reduced, we may have another investor C who is willing to purchase this government security at rupees 90. So a government security whose face value is equal to rupees 100, he is willing to purchase it at rupees 90. So as we can see, depending upon the market conditions, the bond price, this may increase to above the face value or the bond price may decrease to below the face value. Now, whenever the bond prices change, the bond yield would also change accordingly. Now, how do you calculate the bond yield here? The bond yield can be calculated as the interest rate divided by the bond price into 100%. So, this is how you will be able to calculate the yield rates. Now, can you see here that the bond price, it is in the denominator. So, can I say that if it is in the denominator, the bond price and bond yield are inversely proportional to each other. That is, if the bond price increase, obviously the yield rates would be lower. On the other hand, if the bond price reduce, the yield rates would increase. The logic is quite simple here. If you purchase something at a higher price, the rate of returns would be lower. If you purchase something at a lower price, the rate of interest would be higher. The same logic is applicable here as well. For example, now if you calculate the bond yield for investor B, it will be 10 divided by 110, that is the bond price, into 100. So bond yield for him would be 9.09%. But the bond yield for investor C here, it will be 10 divided by 90 into 100, that is be equal to 11.11%. So as you can see, bond price of rupees 90 gives us a yield of 11.11%, whereas the bond price of rupees 110 gives us a bond yield of 9.09%. That is why we say that the bond price and bond yield are inversely proportional to each other. So please understand here, when the demand increases, the bond prices increase, because of which the yield rates reduce. When the demand reduces, the price reduces, and hence the yield rates would increase. Now coming to various factors which affect the yield rates on the government securities in India. So basically there are three factors. One is the extent of government's borrowings. The second one is the rate of interest in US. And the third one is the rate of interest in the Indian economy. So coming to the first aspect, that is the government's borrowings. So here basically how much money the government is borrowing, or how much money the government is expected to borrow, that in turn has an impact on the yield rates in the government securities. So the logic is quite simple here. If the government is going to borrow more amount of money through the issuance of the government securities, obviously the supply of government securities is going to increase. As the supply increases, the demand for the government securities would reduce. Because of decrease in demand, the prices of the existing government securities would reduce, and hence the yield rates on the existing government securities would increase. So what has happened is, in the latest union budget, the finance minister has announced that the central government alone would borrow approximately around 12 lakh crores from the market, and most of these borrowings are going to be done through the issuance of the government securities. And that is precisely the reason as to why the bond yields in the Indian economy have increased to more than 6%. This is as far as the existing government securities is concerned, and that is quite logical to understand. But what about the newly issued government securities, or those government securities which are likely to be issued by the RBI in future? See, RBI, when it wants to sell these government securities, RBI normally carries out an auction. Here, let's say in this particular auction, we have three bidders, A, B, C. These three bidders will be required to bid in terms of how much yield are they expecting from the Reserve Bank of India. Say A is expecting an yield of 6.10, B is expecting an yield of 6.25, C is expecting an yield of 6.50. So here they are basically saying as to what is the return which they are expecting upon their investment in the government security. So from the perspective of RBI, it is good if the RBI allocates the government security to the bidder who is asking for the lowest return. In this particular case, it will be assigned to the investor A. Now, when these three investors, that is A, B and C, when they are carrying out a bidding, obviously to bid for the new government securities, they will keep in mind the yields on the existing government securities. So, if the yield of the existing government securities, let's say, if it increases to more than 6.50%, in that particular case, automatically A here will probably ask for 6.60, B here could ask for 6.70 and so on. So here, the yield rates on the existing government securities can in a way act as a benchmark for the yields on the newly issued government securities. Now, in this particular case, let's say RBI decides to allocate the government security to the investor A here, who has bid for a return of 6.10. Now, this 6.10 will become the rate of interest for this new government security. Now, just imagine if the yield rates on the existing government security keep on increasing to, let's say, 6.50%, now investor A would bid for the lowest percent of 6.60. Earlier, the Reserve Bank of India used to issue this government security to investor A at 6.10%, but now it will be required to issue the government security to this investor at 6.60%. So as you can see, the rate of interest in the government security has increased. And if that happens, obviously the borrowing cost of the government is set to increase. So as the yield rates on the existing government securities keep on increasing, the borrowing cost of the government would increase. The government would be required to pay more amount of money in the form of interest. That is why the Reserve Bank of India has been desperately trying to bring down the yield rates to below 6%. By bringing it down to below 6%, it is in fact making it easier for the government to borrow at a lower cost. This is the first impact of higher yields on the Indian economy. That is, higher yield would lead to higher borrowing costs for the government. Secondly, if the yield rates on the government securities keep on increasing, the investors would expect a higher yields even on the corporate bonds. So let's say earlier the yields of the corporate bonds was equal to 6%. Now they would probably expect a yield of 6.50% simply because the yield rates on the existing government securities have increased. So if the yield rates on the corporate bonds increase, obviously the corporates would be required to borrow money at a higher rate of interest, and thus this will have an adverse impact on the private sector investment. Nextly, the yield rates on the long-term government securities have been linked to the rate of interest on the long-term loans, such as say the home loans, vehicle loans, and so on. So if the yield rates on the long-term government securities increase, obviously the rate of interest on the home loans, the rate of interest on the vehicle loans, and so on would increase. And as the rate of interest in the Indian economy increases, this would have an adverse impact on the credit creation. And mind you, here we are talking about the increase in the rate of interest, particularly when the Indian economy is facing recession, and hence a decrease in credit creation would prolong the economic recession even further. So the rising yield rates are undoubtedly a danger for the Indian economy. And lastly, see, you as an investor, you can invest your money either in shares or bonds and the government securities. Now, the yield rates on the bonds, government securities is increasing. So you are likely to make more amount of profits or returns by investing in bonds and government securities rather than investing in the shares. So what you as an investor can probably do is, whatever money which you have invested in shares, that money you can get it by selling of the shares, and that money you can invest in the government securities. So obviously, if more number of investors are selling off their shares in order to make an investment in the bonds or the government securities, this will have an impact on both Sensex as well as Nifty. Now coming to the link between the rate of interest in US and the yield rates on the government securities in India. So in case of US, if the federal bank has adopted the quantity to easing policy, it means that more amount of dollar is being circulated in the US economy. So obviously some amount of these dollars would flow into the Indian economy in form of both FDI as well as FPI. This will also lead to the increase in rupee appreciation. The rupee value would appreciate vis-a-vis dollars. So let's say now more number of investors are investing in the form of FPI, particularly in terms of the government securities. So there would be a higher demand for the government securities in India. As the demand for G-Secs in India increases, their bond prices would increase and we'll have a decrease in the yield rates on the government securities. As far as Fed tapering is concerned, if the US Fed Bank starts increasing the policy rates, or if it gives just a mere hint that it may decide to increase the policy rates in future, automatically less number of investors from US would be interested to make an investment in the Indian economy. Rather, more number of people who have already invested in the Indian economy would want to sell off their shares, they would want to sell off their bonds and then go back and make an investment in US. So in this particular case, the demand for the government securities in the Indian economy would reduce, bond prices would reduce, and hence the yield rates in the government securities would increase. So as I said, The US Fed Bank has merely hinted that the policy rates may increase in future. This mere hint given by the US Fed Bank has in turn led to a slight increase in the yield rates on the government securities in India. Now coming to the third aspect of the relationship between the interest rates in the Indian economy and the yield rates. Let's consider the two scenarios of decrease and increase in the rate of interest. For the purpose of simplification, let's understand this increase or decrease in the rate of interest in terms of loans as well as deposits. In the first case, let us understand as to what would happen if there is decrease in the rate of interest in the Indian economy. Let's say there is a decrease in rate of interest in loans from 7% to 4%. So obviously, more number of people would take loans and this would lead to increase in the liquidity in the Indian economy. So as the liquidity increases, the demand for the government securities would increase, their bond prices would increase, and hence there would be decrease in the yield rates on the government securities. At the same time, let's say now you as an investor, you have basically two options. You can either deposit your money in the form of fixed deposit in the bank, or you can use this particular money to buy a government security. Now what has happened is there is decrease in the rate of interest in the Indian economy. Earlier, if you have deposited the money in the bank account, you are getting 7% rate of interest, but now you are getting only 4% rate of interest. So obviously, if you keep your money in the fixed deposit, the rate of returns which you are able to get is quite lower. So now you would want to buy more of government securities. So automatically, in the event of decrease in the rate of interest in the Indian economy, more number of people would want to buy government securities simply because their rate of returns would be higher. So in this particular case, once again, there would be decrease in the yield rates on the government securities. Now consider the second scenario of increase in the rate of interest in the Indian economy, let's say from 7% to 10%. Earlier, you're able to get loans at 7% rate of interest, but now you're getting loans at 10% rate of interest. So the amount of loans which will be taken by the people would be quite lower, leading to decrease in the liquidity. So the demand for the government securities would reduce, bond prices would reduce, and hence there would be increase in the yield rates on the government securities. At the same time, consider the same example here. Now you as an investor, you can keep your money either in the form of deposits or the government securities. Earlier, if you have kept your money in the form of deposits, you are getting only 7% rate of interest, but now you are getting 10% rate of interest. So your returns on keeping this particular money in the form of deposits is much higher rather than in keeping in the form of government securities. So automatically the demand for government securities would reduce, the bond price would reduce, and hence there would be increase in the yields on the government securities. So basically there are three most dominant factors that affect the yield rates on the government securities. The first one being the government's borrowings, second one being the rate of interest in the US economy, and the third one being the rate of interest in the Indian economy. Right now, the most dominant factor that has led to increase in the yield rates on the government securities is the increase in the government's borrowings. So based upon our discussion, please try to attempt these two prelims questions for the practice. Please do let us know the answers in the comment section. With this, let us take up the next article. Now coming to the next article about the government policies towards the pulses in the Indian agriculture. Now this particular article shall be important mainly with respect to the prelims. Let us understand the context of this particular article. See, in the recent times, there has been a large scale increase in the prices of pulses in the domestic market, because of which even the consumer price index has also increased. Hence, in order to increase the supply of pulses in the Indian domestic market, the government has basically taken two steps. One, the government has decided to crack down on hoarding and black marketing. And second, the government has allowed free import of pulses from other countries into the Indian domestic market. Hence, by these two measures, it is expected that the overall supply of pulses in the Indian domestic market would increase. The increase in supply would in turn help us bring down the prices of pulses and thus benefit the consumers. But at the same time, this particular article here highlights certain problems and concerns with respect to this particular aspect. First and foremost, the article has highlighted that this would go against the interest of farmers. Why? Now just imagine if we allow for more import of pulses into the domestic market, obviously this will lead to decrease in the prices of pulses in the domestic market. And if the prices of pulses reduce, obviously the farmers will not be able to get higher value on their produce. So this goes against the interest of farmers. And this would also go against the interest of Indian agriculture as well. Why is that? Now, for example, if the prices of pulses in the present cropping season reduce, obviously the farmers would have no incentives to grow pulses in the next cropping season. And if they don't grow pulses, the production of pulses in the next cropping season would reduce, and we may be forced to import more amount of pulses in the next cropping season. Now, this was a problem which was specifically highlighted by the Economic Survey 2019-20, wherein the Economic Survey had highlighted this particular problem known as the cobweb phenomena. So, as far as your examination is concerned, first and foremost, you should understand about the trends in cultivation and production of pulses. This becomes quite important because, as you must have seen in the previous year prelims, a number of questions have been asked with respect to trends in the production of various agricultural commodities. Next, the steps taken by the government to increase the cultivation of pulses, a concept of the price stabilization fund, and the cobweb phenomena. So what we will do is, we will try to cover these topics in the form of prelims-based MCQs, starting with the trends in production and cultivation of pulses. See, presently India is the world's largest producer of pulses. Pulses presently occupy almost around 30 million hectares of agriculture land, and the total production of pulses is around 23 million hectares. More than 80% of the pulses predominantly grown in the rain-fed areas, and hence they are considered to be quite significant for the poor farmers. The top pulses which are grown in case of India are chickpeas, that is chana, pigeon pea, arhar or tur dal, urad, mung beans, lentils and peas. As far as the states in which largest production of pulses takes place include states such as Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, UP, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Telangana and so on, wherein these states alone account for almost 90% of the total pulses production. Apart from that, there has been change in the location as to where these pulses are basically grown. Earlier they were predominantly grown in the northern India, but now they are predominantly grown in the central and the southern part of India. In spite of the fact that India is largest producer of the pulses across the world, India is a net importer of pulses. On an annual basis, we are importing almost around 25% of our pulses requirements. So based upon this understanding, let us try to solve this particular prelims question for the practice. With respect to trends in the production of pulses in India, consider the following statements. Despite being the world's largest producer of pulses, India is a net importer, which, as we have discussed, is correct. The percentage of area under the pulses has declined considerably in the last decade. Now, this particular pie chart here shows the area under various agricultural crops in the last one decade, that is from the year 2007-8 to 2018-19. As you can see, the percentage of area under rice and wheat, this has remained almost stagnant in the last one decade. As far as pulses is concerned, there is a slight improvement in the percentage of area under the pulses. So if you go back to the question here, the question says that it has declined considerably, which is actually wrong. The next one, it says that the per capita net availability of pulses has reduced since 1951. What do you think about this particular statement? Is it correct or false? You would be surprised to know that this particular statement is actually correct. As you can see in this particular table here, the per capita net availability of pulses in 1951, that was 22 kgs per year. But in the year 2018-19, this has dropped down to almost around 18 kgs per year. As far as the other food grains is concerned, for example, rice, wheat, cereals, food grains, etc. All of these have registered an increase in the per capita availability. It is only the pulses that has seen a decline in the per capita availability. So if you go back to the statement here, it says that it has reduced, which is actually correct. Accordingly, the right answer would be C, that is 1 and 3 only. Now coming to the price stabilization fund, see, the prices of some of the agricultural commodities is highly volatile, and this volatility in the prices of agricultural commodities can affect both consumers as well as the farmers. Now, for example, if there is a drastic increase in the prices, the consumers would get adversely impacted, and if there is a drastic fall in the prices, then this can impact the farmers. So in order to protect the consumers and the farmers from the volatility in the prices of some of the agricultural commodities, what we have is a price stabilization fund. Under the price stabilization fund, basically the government procures some of the agricultural commodities from the farmers, builds the buffer, and whenever there is a drastic increase in their prices, from this particular buffer, it will release some stock into the market, and by releasing the stock, the supply of these agricultural commodities increases, and hence we would be able to bring down their prices. So basically the price stabilization fund is a central sector scheme of the government. It was initially created with a corpus of rupees 500 crores. Initially it covered only onion and potato, and later on pulses were added. And please note here that this particular scheme is implemented by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, Food and Public Distribution. And this corpus, the corpus of price stabilization fund, is maintained with the Small Farmers Agri-Business Consortium. Now coming to a practice question, it says as to which categories of agricultural commodities are presently covered under the price stabilization fund to check the undue increase in their prices. As I discussed before, it presently covers onion, potato and pulses. It does not cover rice and wheat. Accordingly, the right answer should be B, that is 1, 2 and 3 only. Now coming to the next practice question about the cobweb phenomena. Now, the cobweb phenomena basically seeks to explain the large-scale volatility in the prices of pulses in the Indian domestic market. Usually in case of India, for one cropping season, the prices of pulses would be higher, and immediately in the next cropping season, their prices would be lower. Now this particular aspect has been explained through the cobweb phenomena. Now usually the farmers will decide to grow a particular crop in a season depending upon the prices which they have got in the previous cropping season. So in the previous cropping season, if they have got higher prices, automatically in the present cropping season, they would grow the same crop. On the other hand, if in the previous cropping season, if they got lower prices, then in the present cropping season, they would not grow the same crop. So the large scale volatility in the prices of pulses has been explained through the cobweb phenomena. Now let's say for a particular season, more number of farmers are growing the pulses. This is so because in the previous season they have got higher prices. Now when they are growing more amount of pulses, obviously the supply of pulses would be more than the demand, and if that happens, then the prices of the pulses would reduce. Now the prices of pulses reduce, then in the next cropping season, the production of pulses would reduce. And if that happens, once again, in this particular case, demand would be more than the supply, and because of which the prices would increase. And if the prices increase, once again, in the next cropping season, more number of farmers would grow pulses in order to take the advantage. So this particular cycle keeps on repeating itself. So that is what we call it as the cobweb phenomena. So the right answer to this particular question here is C, that is volatility in the prices of pulses. You must understand here that out of the 4 options which are given here, you would have to choose the option which is most closest to the correct answer, and that happens to be C, that is volatility in the prices of pulses. Now coming to the next article, the article is titled as The History of Tulu and the Demand for the Official Language Status. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Polity and Governance. From this particular article, basically 2 things are important. One is the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, and the other one is the classical languages in India. As you can see, in prelims 2014, already a question has been asked as to which of these languages have been declared as the classical languages by the Indian government. Presently, the Indian government has declared 6 languages as classical languages. These languages include Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, Telugu, Sanskrit and Odia. Odia is the latest entry to the list of the classical languages. Apart from that, the Ministry of Culture has come out with the detailed guidelines as to on what grounds a particular language can be declared as a classical language. Some of these grounds include, first and foremost, a language must have ancient text or a literature which is at least around 1500 to 2000 years old. Secondly, it should have its own literary tradition and it should not be borrowed from another language. Thirdly, the modern offshoots of this particular language, they should be completely distinct from the classical language and so on. So there are certain guidelines which the government has come out with, and if a particular language is fulfilling these guidelines, then such a language would be given the status of a classical language. So as you can see, the right answer to this particular question would be C, that is 2 and 3 only. Now this particular article basically highlights that the Tulu speaking people have recently started a campaign on Twitter demanding for their language to be included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. As you can see here, the Tulu speaking people, they are basically spread across the 2 coastal districts of Karnataka, these 2 being Udupi and Dakshin Kannada. Apart from that, they are also found in the northern part of the Kasaragod district of Kerala. According to Census 2011, presently there are almost around 18 lakh Tulu speaking people. According to some of the scholars, Tulu is considered to be one of the earliest Dravidian languages, dating back to almost around 2000 years. Apart from that, a very famous scholar known as Robert Caldwell has highlighted that Tulu is one of the most well-developed Dravidian languages in India. So this particular language has a rich legacy, it has a rich literature, because of which the Tulu speaking people have been demanding that Tulu should be included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. Now, as discussed before, the Ministry of Culture has come up with a detailed guidelines for the inclusion of a language as a classical language. But as of now, we do not have any objective criteria for a language to be included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. In the year 2003, the Government of India had appointed a committee under the leadership of Sitakant Mohapatra. Now this particular committee has already submitted its recommendation and the government is still studying its recommendations as of now. So as of now, there is no objective criteria for including a language in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. So presently here, as of now, we have a number of demands for the inclusion of languages in the 8th schedule. As you can see, according to a report published by the Ministry of Home Affairs, as of now, there is a demand that at least 38 more languages should be included in the 8th schedule. Some of these languages include Angika, Banjara, Chhattisgarhi, Dhadki, Kokbarak, Limbu, Sambalpuri, Shorseni, Taindi, Tulu, etc. See, as far as your prelims examination is concerned, you should be aware about basic details about the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution. 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution has provided for a list of languages which are recognized by the Indian Constitution. So as you can see, originally 14 languages were included in the Indian Constitution. Later on, Sindhi language was added. Later, 3 more languages, that is Konkani, Manipuri and Nepali, were added in the year 1992. And the latest modification added the languages which include Bodo, Dogri, Maithili and Santali, and these languages were included in the year 2004. So when a language is included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, automatically these languages are recognized by Sahitya Academy. Similarly, the books in these languages can easily be translated to the other languages. Apart from that, the students who are appearing for the government exams, they can write their exams in these languages which have been recognized by the Indian Constitution. So because of these benefits associated with a language being included in the 8th schedule, the Tulu speaking people have also been demanding that their language should be included in the 8th schedule. So look at this particular practice question. It says, as to which among the following languages have been included in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution through the 92nd Amendment. The 92nd Amendment was passed in the year 2004. So as you can see here, to the 92nd Amendment, we have included Bodo, Dogri, Maithili and Santali. So the right answer here would be 2 and 3 only. The next article is related to the filing of election petitions in India. This article is important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of polity and governance. As part of this particular article, we will be discussing various facets related to the election petitions in India. See, election petition is basically a petition which is filed before the concerned High Court in order to challenge the election of a candidate who has won in a recently held parliamentary or a assembly election. So, if a particular candidate wins in a recently held parliamentary or a assembly election through illegal or unethical means, then his election can be challenged by filing an election petition. The grounds on which an election petition can be filed include, first and foremost, if a winning candidate was not qualified to contest the elections. Now, for example, there are certain constituencies in India which are exclusively reserved for SCs and STs. So, if a candidate belonging to general merit contests the elections in such constituencies and wins the election, then his election can be declared as null and void. Similarly, if a candidate is involved in commission of any corrupt practice, for example, if he has made an appeal to the voters to vote on the grounds of religion, caste, etc. Similarly, if he has been involved in use of money and muscle power to influence the voters, then his election can be challenged. Next is improper filing of nomination. Now, for example, while filing the nomination, a candidate may not have declared his true assets and liabilities. A candidate may not have declared his criminal antecedents. In such cases, his election can be challenged. And lastly, if a winning candidate has not complied with the provisions of the Constitution or the rules which have been made under the Representation of People's Act, even then his election can be challenged. Please do note that the election petitions can be filed before the High Court in the state in which the elections have been conducted. So the High Courts have the original jurisdiction to hear the election petitions. Original jurisdiction here means directly a person can approach the High Court and not necessarily through an appeal. The election petition can be filed either by a losing candidate or any elector within a constituency, but there is a time limit. Here, the candidate or an elector must file the petition within 45 days of the declaration of the results. And the Representation of People's Act recommend that this election petition trial should ideally be completed within a time frame of 6 months. And please do understand here that if a particular person is not happy with the order passed by the High Court, then such a person can obviously appeal before the Supreme Court. So, as far as the filing of election petition is concerned, the High Courts have original jurisdiction. The High Courts do not have exclusive jurisdiction. They do not have exclusive jurisdiction because an aggrieved party can file an appeal before the Supreme Court of India as well. So these are some important aspects which you need to know with respect to filing of election petitions in India. Based upon our discussion, here is the practice question number 7. The question is, with respect to election petitions in India, consider the following statements. The High Courts have both original and exclusive jurisdiction to hear the election petitions, which is actually wrong. The second statement is the election petition can be filed either by the candidate or the elector, which is correct. So right answer in this particular case is B, that is 2 only. With this, we have come to the end of this week's discussion. Thank you one and all.